The westbound came into Harrow Bend, Nebraska at 4 minutes past 11 on the 9th of April, 1884, and the first thing the town learned about Hulda Brenner was her weight. Not her name, not where she came from, or what she could do with her hands, or that she had buried a father in February and sold his tools in March and spent nearly everything she had on a ticket to a place she had never seen. Her weight. Because the step down from a Union Pacific coach is a long step for anybody, and it is a longer one for a woman who carries 294 pounds, and because the brakeman, being helpful in the way that hurts worst, dragged the freight scale over from the platform and set it down beside the coach steps so she would have something solid to come down onto. It was a plank scale. It had a beam and a poise and a brass face, and it was meant for weighing crates of nails and sacks of seed wheat. And when she put her whole self down on it, the beam swung up and knocked against its top with a sound like a spoon on a pot. Half the town was on that platform. It was train day. Train day in a town 11 months old is the whole of the week's entertainment, and there were perhaps 40 people standing there in the wind with nothing to do but look. And every one of them looked. A boy of about 9 read the beam out loud the way boys do, because a number is a number, and he had just learned to slide the poise at his father's store. 294 pounds, he said. 294, paw. There was that half second of nothing. Then the laughing started at the back, near the freight door, and came forward through the crowd the way fire goes through cured grass, and by the time it reached the front of the platform, it had turned into something with a shape to it. A real noise. Men slapping their thighs, and one woman with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth, and her shoulders going up and down. Hulda Brenner stepped off the scale onto the boards. She set down her carpetbag. She straightened her bonnet, which the wind had shoved back off her forehead, and she looked out over that crowd with a face that gave them absolutely nothing, and she waited for it to stop, the way you wait out weather. It took a while. It always takes a while. She was 28 years old. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she was very heavy. Heavy in the way that a person is who has been heavy since girlhood and has stopped apologizing for it somewhere along the line, broad through the shoulder and thick through the arm and wide at the hip, with a round full face and a double chin and small steady gray eyes set in it. Her hair was dark blonde and pinned up under a faded blue sunbonnet. She wore a gray calico dress that had been let out twice at the seams and a canvas apron over it, and her boots were a man's boots, size 8, because no store in Freeport, Illinois, carried a woman's boot that would take her foot and still hold up to a brickyard. She had come out to be married. That was the thing none of them knew yet, standing there, laughing. She had in the pocket of her apron 4 letters folded into a square, tied with a bootlace, soft as cloth at the creases from being read. They were from a man named Orrin Hale, who had 160 acres on the north side of the Middle Loop, 2 miles out from a town site called Harrow Bend, and who had written to an advertisement she had answered in a Chicago weekly. He had written that he was 34 years old, that he had broken 30 acres and had a dugout and a good well and 11 head, and that he was not much for looks but was steady, and that if she was willing to come he would meet the train and they would go straight to the preacher, or wait a week if she wanted the week, whichever suited her. In the last letter he had written one line she had read more times than the rest of it put together. He had written, "I am told you are a large woman. I am glad of it. This is not a country for a small one." She had cried over that line in a boarding house in Freeport with her father 4 days dead and the brick yard sold out from under her. And then she had washed her face and gone down and bought the ticket. Now she stood on the platform at Harrow Bend and looked for a man of 34 with a red beard, because he had told her the beard was red and that she would not mistake him. There was no such man. The laughing wound down the way it does. The crowd began to remember they had things to be doing. The freight was coming off the car and a wagon was backing up for it, and the boy who had read the beam was hauled off by the ear at last by a woman in a good gray traveling coat, though not before she had got a long, unhurried look at Hulda herself, top to bottom, the kind of look a buyer gives a horse she has already decided not to buy. A young man came out of the crowd toward her. He was maybe 26, weary, sandy, with a thin mustache he was too young for, a battered hat pushed back, and a dusty vest, and he came with his thumbs in his belt and his chin out, and she knew before he opened his mouth that he was going to be trouble, because a man does not walk at a woman that way unless he has decided something about her in advance. "You'd be the Illinois woman," he said. "I would," she said. "Huldah Brenner." He looked her over. He did it slowly and openly so that the people still on the platform could see him doing it, and there was some more laughing, quieter now, the private kind. "Well," he said. "Well now. He sent for a wife and he got a granary." She waited. "I'm Del Hale," he said. "Orrin was my brother." She heard the was. She heard it before he said another word, and something went out from under her, some floor she had been standing on since Freeport, and she put her hand out and took hold of the coach's iron handrail, and the metal was hot from the sun on the black side of the car, and she held on to it anyway. "Was," she said. "Buried him the 21st of March, Del Hale said. "Mule kicked him in the thigh on the 14th, cut him to the bone, and it went bad. Doc took the leg off at the hip on the 19th, and it was too late by then. He was 6 days dying. He said a few things at the end. You wasn't one of them. He said it with his chin still out. He said it like a card he had been holding all morning and had been looking forward to playing. And behind him a man laughed once, one syllable, and cut it off. Huldah Brenner stood very still. The wind came down the platform and took the corner of her apron and shook it and let it go. "I am sorry," she said. "He wrote a good letter." "He wrote 4 of them," Del said. "I know. I posted 3. He'd have done better to buy a stove." Somebody said Del, in a low voice, the way you say a dog's name when it has gone too far in front of company. Del Hale did not turn around. He said, "Now here's the rest of it, so we don't have to have this conversation twice. Orrin's proved up on nothing. He had 2 years on that claim, and he's got no patent and no widow, because you are not a widow, ma'am. You are a woman off a train. His entry dies with him, or it comes to blood. And I'm blood. I've been out to the land office already. I filed to take the relinquishment on the 8th. So there's no place out there for you. There's no house neither." The March fire took the dugout roof and the stable and 40 rod of his west fence, and what's standing is a hole in a bank with a burned ridgepole across it. He took a breath. "There's a train east at 6 tomorrow evening," he said. "I'll stand you the fare. That's more than I owe you, and everybody here can hear me say it." The wind went on blowing. Down the platform the freight men were rolling a barrel, and the barrel made a sound like far-off thunder on the boards. Huldah Brenner let go of the handrail. She picked up her carpet bag, and she took her time about it, and when she straightened she was breathing a little hard, the way heavy people do when they bend, and she let them all watch her breathe, because there was no help for it, and never had been. "I thank you for the offer of the fare," she said. "I won't be taking it." Del Hale laughed. "That's fine," he said. "Sleep in the depot then. It's a free country." And he walked off, and the platform came apart into its pieces, people going down the steps and along toward the 2 blocks of new pine buildings that called themselves a town, and the boy who had read the scale looked back at her twice before his mother pulled him around the corner of the freight house. She stood there until the train pulled out. It is a particular kind of quiet, the quiet after a train leaves a small place. The rails tick. The dust settles back down. Somewhere a windmill turns half a turn and stops. She stood in it with her carpet bag in one hand and her father's brass-bound trunk still sitting up on the platform behind her where the baggage man had dropped it, and she took stock. Because taking stock was what her father had taught her instead of hope. She had $61.40. She had the trunk, and in the trunk she had 2 dresses. Her mother's Bible, a case daguerreotype, a set of brick mason's tools, a 2-foot folding rule, a chalk line, a mason's level with a brass bubble and a woodstock, and a book. She had the 4 letters in her apron pocket. She had a body that had been laughed at on a train platform in front of 40 strangers before it had been offered so much as a drink of water. And she had, though she did not know it yet, and would not know it for 11 more days, the exact skill that this town was going to need in the summer of 1884, and that not one single person in it, herself included, would have paid $1 for on that April afternoon. Her father had made bricks for 31 years, and a sod wall, laid right, is only a wall of bricks that God has already fired for you and left lying in the field. Harrow Bend in April of 1884 was 2 blocks long, and it was proud of itself the way a puppy is proud of itself. It sat on the second bench above the middle loop where the valley widens out, and 11 months before there had been nothing there but a buffalo wallow and a surveyor's stake. Then the railroad had run its grade through, and the Harrow Bend Improvement Company had bought the section and platted it into 240 lots, and the lumber had come in on flat cars, and the town had gone up in 90 days the way those towns did, all raw pine and fresh paint and false fronts a full story higher than the buildings behind them. There were 30 one-frame buildings on the day Halderbrenner arrived. She counted them, because counting was another thing her father had left her instead of hope. A depot, a section house, a lumber and coal yard with its stacks running 200 feet along the siding, a general store with a canvas awning, a hardware, a drugstore that also sold spectacles and coffins, a land locator's office with a painted sign showing a wheat sheaf, a newspaper, the Harrow Bend Clarion, in a shed with a stovepipe through the wall, 2 saloons, one of them calling itself a billiard hall, a livery, a blacksmith, a church with no bell and no steeple, and a mortgage, 11 dwelling houses of 1.5 stories, all of them white, all of them exactly alike, because the improvement company sold a house pattern along with the lots. And at the head of the street, going up that very week, the thing the whole town talked about. The Cosmopolitan Hotel, 2 full stories and a mansard, 31 rooms, with a gallery across the front on turned posts and a cupola on top that a man could stand in and see 9 miles of valley. Every stick of it had come off a flat car. Every stick of it had been sold by one man. His name was Absalom Creed, and he was the agent of the Harrow Bend Lumber and Coal Company, and he was also the secretary of the Improvement Company, and he was also the notary. And he was also the man you saw about a loan, and he was also, though nobody put it that way out loud, the reason the town existed at all. He was about 45, lean, with dark hair combed flat and a waxed mustache and a black frock coat he wore even to walk out on the siding, and he had a way of putting his hand on your shoulder while he told you no that made you feel you had been given something. Halderbrenner would meet him in 4 days, and it would go badly. But that first afternoon, she did not meet anybody at all except the depot agent, who was a decent tired man named Purvis, with a wife in Ohio he had not seen in a year, and who let her leave the brass-bound trunk in the freight room without charging her storage, and who told her, looking at his hands, that the hotel would want $1.25 and the boarding house 6 bits, and that the boarding house was full. She walked into town with her carpetbag. It is one thing to be laughed at on a platform. It is another to walk 200 yards up the only street of a town where every single person already knows what happened on the platform. Word had gone up the street ahead of her at the speed word goes. By the time she passed the general store there were 3 women standing inside the door not buying anything. By the time she passed the billiard hall there were 4 men out on the walk, and one of them said something and the others laughed, and she did not turn her head, and one of them called out an offer to weigh her again for free. She kept walking. Her hip hurt. It had hurt since Omaha, from sitting up 2 nights in a coach seat built for a body half her size, and there is a particular cruelty in a body that hurts you exactly where the world has already told you it is wrong. At the Cosmopolitan Hotel, which was not open yet but had a desk in the front room and a man behind it, she asked about a room and was told there were none, which was a lie, since the hotel was empty and unfinished. She thanked him, and went out. At the boarding house, which was full, a woman came to the door drying her hands and looked at her for perhaps 3 seconds and said, "No," and shut it. At the church, the Reverend Aquila Stubbs, who was young and earnest and had a wife with a new baby and 2 rooms behind the sanctuary, told her she could sleep in the church that night on the bench cushions, and he was sorry it was not more, and he said it with real shame in his face, and she said that it was a great deal, and she was obliged. He gave her a lamp and half a loaf and a jar of milk, and did not once look at her sideways, and for that she would sit in his church every Sunday for 40 years and never once tell him why. She slept on 3 bench cushions laid on the floor with her carpet bag under her head. In the morning she walked out to see the claim. It was 2 miles north and east, and the walking was hard, because the road was new, and the ruts were deep, and the wind out of the northwest came across 9 miles of open prairie with nothing to slow it. Nebraska in April is not a gentle place. The grass was still winter grass, buff and gray and beaten flat, with the new green just showing at the roots, and the sky was enormous and empty, and about 4 times the size of any sky she had ever stood under in Illinois. She had to stop twice. She stopped without embarrassment. There was nobody to see, and the prairie has never in its life cared what a person weighs. She found the quarter section by the fence corner Orrin had described in his second letter, and she stood at it a long time. He had told the truth about all of it. There was the 30 acres broken, lying in black furrow, with last year's sod still turned up in ridges. There was the well with a curb of cottonwood plank. There was the fence, and 40 rod of it was gone to the March fire. Just the burned stubs of the posts standing up out of a black scorch that ran a 1/4 mile and stopped at the creek. And there was the dugout, cut into the south face of a low bank, and its roof had burned in and fallen, and what was left was a black hole in a bank with a charred ridgepole lying across it at an angle, exactly as Del Hale had said. There were 11 head somewhere, she supposed. She did not see them. She learned later that Del had already driven them to his own place, and that nobody in the county thought this was worth remarking on. She went down into the dugout. The floor was dirt and ash. The fire had taken the door and the little window frame and the shelf, but along the back wall, cut into the earth itself, there were 3 niches, and in one of them, sitting up out of the ash where it had fallen when the shelf burned, was a tin box. She sat down on the burned ridgepole to open it, and the ridgepole took her weight and held, which she noticed, because she had spent her whole life noticing which things would take her weight. In the tin box there was a receipt from the Grand Island Land Office. There was a folded plat of the township. There were $2.60 in silver. There was a photograph of 2 boys, one about 12 and one about 4, standing stiff beside a chair, and the older one had his hand on the younger one's shoulder in a way that made her look at it for a long time. And there was a letter, unfinished, written in pencil in a hand that was cramped and slow and that had been made worse by pain. Dated the 17th of March, 4 days before he died. Miss Brenner, it said. I am laid up some. Doc says it may go either way. If it goes the wrong way, you will get to Harrow Bend and find nobody there, and I am sorry for it. That is a hard thing to do to a person. I want to say 2 things while I can hold the pencil. The first is that this ground is good. Everybody in the valley says the ridge north of my line is gumbo and worthless and no good for a plow, and they are right about the plow. But I have dug in it, and it is the best ground in this county for what you want ground for out here, which is not always corn. The second is, do not let my brother, and it stopped there. She sat in a burned dugout on a burned ridgepole and read that 4 times, and then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket with the other 4, and she found that her hands were steady and that she was not crying, and that somewhere underneath the tiredness a thing had lit in her that she recognized from her father's yard. From the days when a kiln went wrong and everybody stood around saying it was ruined, and her father would roll up his sleeves and say, "All right, now we know something We did not know this morning. She climbed up out of the dugout and she walked north to the ridge. It ran east and west for about half a mile, a low swell of ground, maybe 15 feet above the flat, and the grass on it was different from the grass around it. It was buffalo grass and blue grama, short and dense and matted, the kind that has grown in one place undisturbed for 10,000 years and has knitted its roots together into a mat you could not tear apart with your 2 hands and a horse. Hulda Brenner got down on her knees on that ridge, which for her was a project and not a gesture, and she took out the pocket knife that had been her father's, and she cut a square out of the sod and turned it over. The mat of root was 4 inches thick and so tight it held together like a shingle. Under it the soil was dark and heavy and full of fine clay, and when she squeezed a handful, it took the print of her fingers and kept it. She knelt there on that ridge in the wind with a piece of prairie in her hand, and she started, without meaning to laugh, and the laugh had a crack in it because of the 24 hours behind it, and there was nobody within 1.5 miles to hear. Because in her father's brickyard in Freeport, Illinois, the whole business, the entire 31 years of it, had come down to one question asked of every load that came in on the barrow. Will it hold its shape? This would hold its shape. This would hold its shape better than anything she had ever had her hands on in her life. The land office for that district was at Grand Island, 61 miles east and south, and to get there and back cost her $4.40 and 2 days and a piece of her pride she never entirely got back. She went on the 11th of April. She rode in the coach with her hands folded, and a woman across from her moved her skirts twice, and Hulda looked out the window at the valley going by and did not give her the satisfaction of noticing. The office was upstairs over a bank, a long room with a counter and a rail and a wall of pigeonholes and 3 clerks, and it smelled of ink and wet wool and the particular dust that comes off old paper. She waited 1 hour and 40 minutes on a bench built for narrower people, and she waited without complaint. And when her turn came, she went up to the rail, and a clerk named Barnabas Quint looked up at her over a pair of steel spectacles. He was about 60. He had ink on 3 fingers and a green shade on his forehead, and the manner of a man who has heard every possible story and has been surprised by exactly 4 of them. She laid out what she had. The 4 letters, the unfinished one, the receipt from the tin box, the plat. She said, I was to marry Orrin Hale of Section 19. He died the 21st of March. I want to know what I am, in law. Quint read the letters. He read all 5 slowly, and when he came to the unfinished one he read it twice, and he set them down and squared the edges with 2 fingers. In law, he said, you are nothing to him. I am sorry to say it that plain but plain is kinder. An entryman's rights don't pass to a woman he wrote letters to. They don't pass to a woman he was engaged to. If you'd married him the day before he died, you'd stand in his shoes and could prove up on his time. You did not. The entry is canceled, and the land goes back to the government, and any man may file on it, and I see here a man already has. The 8th of April. Hale. Dell, she said, I understood that. He waited. She said, so let us leave off what I am not and take up what I am. Mr. Quint, I am 28 years old. I have never been married. I am a citizen, born in Illinois. I have not filed on land anywhere, and I have not sold my right. Am I not exactly the person the Homestead Act was written for? There was a silence on the other side of the rail. Then Barnabas Quint took the green shade off his forehead and set it on the counter and looked at her properly for the first time. You are, he said. Some clerks in some offices, in those years, would have found ways to make it difficult. There were men who did not believe a single woman ought to hold land and who would find a reason. Quint was not one of them. He had a daughter who had filed in Custer County 3 years before and had proved up on it and was doing better than her brothers, and he had lately come to hold a private opinion that a woman who had gotten herself to a land office at all was already more of a settler than half the men who came in with a locator holding their elbow. He said, what do you want to file on? She put her finger on the plat. "The northwest quarter of Section 18, she said. "The ridge." Quint looked at where her finger was and then up at her. "That's gumbo," he said. "That's the piece nobody's taken in that whole township, and there's a reason. It's got a hard pan under it about 2 feet down. It'll break your plow, and it'll hold water on top after a rain like a dish, and it'll crack open in August wide enough to lose a hoe in. There's better ground open 6 miles west." "Yes," she said. "I know what it is. I want it." He looked at her a moment longer, and then he did a thing she remembered for the rest of her life, which was that he did not ask her again. He simply turned the register around and dipped the pen and pushed it across. $14, he said. "Filing fee and commissions. You'll have 6 months to establish residence, and you'll want a witness or two who will swear to it later. And ma'am," he tapped the plat, "mind the plat line. That ridge runs right up against the Harrow Bend Townsite plat on its south side. The improvement company holds all of Section 19 north half. Some of these townsite companies get very particular about what goes up near their lots. Know exactly where your line is before you build." Exactly, not close. She paid her $14. She had $42 and change left in the world. She rode back the next day and got down at Harrow Bend at dusk and slept a second night on the church cushions, and on the morning of the 13th of April she borrowed the Reverend Stubbs's clothesline, which was 90 feet of quarter-inch cotton rope, and she took her father's 2-foot folding rule out of the brass-bound trunk, and she went out to the ridge and did something the town found so funny that they were still telling it in the fall. She measured. She measured the way a brick mason's daughter measures, which is to say she did not trust her eye about anything. She found the government corner stone at the section line, a limestone marker with the notches on it half buried and grown over. She cleaned it off with her hands. She marked her rope at 16.5 feet, 1 rod, with strips torn off her under petticoat, and she measured that rope against the folding rule 3 separate times, twice at the start and once at the end of the day, because cotton rope stretches when it is dry and shrinks when it is damp, and a rope that lies to you is worse than no rope. And then she walked the line, all that day and most of the next, down on the flat and up over the ridge and back, laying the rope out and picking it up, 4 rods at a time, 80 times, with the wind trying to take it out of her hands and her back going into a knot and her knees telling her about it every time she bent. And by mid-afternoon of the second day she had 4 willow stakes driven and the northwest corner of her quarter section pinned to thee. Ground to within, she reckoned, about 2 feet. 3 men came out from town on the second afternoon to watch. They sat their horses at 40 yards and made remarks she could hear parts of. One of them was Del Hale. Another one asked her, in a voice pitched to Carrie, whether she was measuring the ground or the ground was measuring her. She straightened up with the rope in her fist and looked at him, and she said, in an ordinary voice, without any heat in it at all, "I am finding out where I stand." You are welcome to watch a woman do that. Not many get the chance. That got repeated too, though not by him. What her measuring told her was this, and it was the single most valuable thing anybody in that county learned that spring, though she was the only one who knew it at the time. The south line of her quarter section, and therefore the north line of the Harrow Bend Townsite plat, ran along the foot of the ridge on the flat ground. The crown of the ridge, where the grass was thickest and the ground was highest, and where a person would want to put a house, lay 41 rods north of that line. 676 feet, an eighth of a mile and better. She was outside the plat. Well outside. Not close. Outside, which meant that whatever the Harrow Bend Improvement Company had written into its deeds and its ordinances about what a person might and might not build, and how it might and might not be built, and out of what material, applied to her exactly as much as the weather in Chicago did. She drove her corner stakes deep, and she banked stones around them, and then she went and sat on the crown of the ridge with her back against a stake and looked south. From up there she could see the whole of Harrow Bend laid out below her. A mile off, all 31 white buildings and the black line of the railroad and the long yellow stacks of the lumber yard along the siding, and the framing of the Cosmopolitan Hotel going up at the head of the street with men on it like ants, and the whole town looked from there exactly like what it was, which was a box of matchwood set down in the middle of 800 square miles of grass. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got up, with effort, and went down to town to see about buying lumber, because she was not a fool and she did not intend to be a martyr, and a frame house is a fine thing to live in if a person can get one. That was the 14th of April, and that was the day she met Absalom Creed. The lumber and coal yard was the biggest thing in Harrow Bend, and it was laid out to be looked at. The stacks ran 200 feet along the siding, dimensioned stuff and shiplap and flooring and finish, all of it Wisconsin pine, all of it sorted and stickered and squared off at the end so the piles came up clean. And the whole yard smelled so strongly of pitch and fresh sawing that a person walking in off the prairie stopped for a second and breathed it in without meaning to. The office was a neat little building at the gate with a bay window, and Absalom Creed came out of it with his hand already extended, because he had been watching her come up the street from that window for 200 yards. "Miss Brenner," he said, "Absalom Creed. I have wanted to make your acquaintance since Wednesday, and I am ashamed it has taken me until Monday. May I say first that what occurred at the depot was a disgrace, and that I have spoken to 2 of the men involved. He was good. She had to give him that. Then and afterward. He was very good. He took her into the office and sat her in a chair with arms, which is a small thing that a large woman notices in her bones, and he did not look at her body once. Not once. Which after 5 days in Harrow Bend was so unusual that it did half his work for him before he opened his mouth about business. "I know your situation," he said. "This is a small place. Hale's death was a bad piece of luck for him and a worse one for you. Now," he put his fingertips together, "what can the yard do for you?" She told him. She wanted a house 16 by 24 one-story with a half loft. She had priced it out of the pattern book at the hardware, and she had a list, and she put the list on his desk. Sills, joists, studding, rafters, shiplap, siding, flooring, 4 windows, 1 door, shingles, nails, and a stovepipe. She had figured it 3 times, and she made it $281 and some cents. Creed read her list, and his eyebrows went up in a way that was almost respect. "You figured this yourself," he said. "I have. You figured it low on the nails, and you forgot the building paper. But you figured it." He set it down. $294 delivered on the ground. "Which is a curious figure," he added pleasantly, and then he watched her face to see if the joke had landed. It had landed. She did not give him anything. "I have $42, she said. Creed nodded slowly, as though she had said something wise. "Then we are talking about credit," he said. "And that is a conversation I have 11 times a week, and it is my favorite part of this business, because credit is not charity, Miss Brenner. Credit is a wager on a person. So let me lay my cards out." He leaned back. "The company will carry a settler for the whole of a house, the whole $294, at 10% secured on the crop and the improvement, payable in 3 years. I have made that same wager 40, sometimes in 11 months. I made it with the Pikes and the Nordstroms and the Barclay boys and the fellow that runs the drugstore. It is the engine of this town. Do you understand me? The company does not make its money on the lumber. It makes its money because a man in a house stays, and a man who stays buys a lot. And a lot on a street with houses on it is worth 4 times a lot on a street with nothing." He let that sit. "So," he said, and here he smiled, and it was a good warm smile, "so the question is not whether I will carry a woman. Because I will, and I have. There are 2 widows in this town in company houses. The question is what I am securing. Where is this house to be?" "On my quarter," she said. "Section 18. The ridge north of the town." The smile did not go anywhere. It stayed exactly where it was, but everything behind it changed, the way a lamp goes out behind a curtain. "The Gumbo Ridge," he said. "Yes, Miss Brenner." He sat forward. "That ground will not grow a crop." "I am not being unkind. I am being an accountant. There is a clay pan under it 2 foot down. You cannot put a plow through it, and you cannot get corn out of it, and there is no crop for me to secure a note against. That is the whole of it. If you take a 1/4 miles west on the good bottom, I will have lumber on your ground Thursday, and I will shake your hand doing it." She said, "The ridge is filed and paid for. $14 the 11th. "Then let it lie," he said. "File a relinquishment. It costs you the $14, which is a hard loss, and I will personally make it good out of my own pocket, and we will start you fresh on ground that will pay." And she said, "No." It was the first time in 11 months that anybody had said that word to Absalom Creed in that office, and she saw it go into him, and she watched him decide something. He got up and went to the window and looked out at his stacks. "May I ask why?" he said. "Because he wrote me it was good ground," she said. "Because he dug in it, and he said it was the best ground in the county for what a person wants ground for out here, which is not always corn. And because I have been on it, and I have had it in my hands, and I believe he was right, and I have got exactly one thing left in this world that belonged to that man, and it is his opinion." Creed turned around. "That is sentiment," he said, quite gently, "and sentiment is the most expensive thing sold west of the Missouri." Then he came back and sat down and folded his hands and gave her the real answer, and to his credit, or to something, he gave it to her straight. "I am going to tell you what you would find out anyway," he said. "There is another reason, and you may as well have it. The Improvement Company has spent 11 months and a very great deal of Eastern money persuading a certain kind of settler that Harrow Bend is not a dirt town. Do you know what the single largest obstacle is to selling a lot in a Nebraska town site to a man in Ohio? It is the photograph. It is that every man in Ohio has seen a photograph of a Nebraska soddy with a cow standing on the roof and a family in front of it in their good clothes looking like they have been dug up out of the ground. Every dollar of Eastern money that comes into this valley comes in because we have persuaded somebody that this is a white-painted town. 31 buildings, not one of them dirt. The hotel is going up 2 stories with a cupola for exactly one reason, which is so that it can be photographed and printed, and that photograph is worth $11,000 a year to this company in lot sales. He tapped the desk once. "Now?" he said. "You propose to put yourself on the crown of a ridge 15 foot above the flat, 1 mile due north of the depot, in the exact line of sight of every passenger on every train that comes into this valley. And you propose, since you cannot buy lumber, and I think we both know you cannot, to put up a soddy there. The first thing a man from Ohio will see out of that window before he sees my hotel, before he sees my street, is a dirt house on a hill. I would rather he saw a house," she said, "than a woman sleeping in a church. I would rather," said Creed, "that he saw neither." And there it was, out on the desk between them, plain as a bill of lading. She stood up. It took her a moment. She did it without hurrying, and she picked up her list and folded it. "Mr. Creed," she said, "I came in here to buy lumber and be in debt to you for 3 years, and I would have paid you every cent, and you would have had my note, and I would have had a floor. You have decided against it. Very well. But I want you to hear one thing before I go out that door, so that later on neither of us can say it was not said." "Say it," he said. "You have got 31 buildings in this town, and every one of them is 1 inch of pine standing on edge," she said. "I was raised in a brick yard. My father used to say that a wall is a bet you make with the weather. You have made your bet. I am going to make mine. And this country is going to settle it between us, and it will not ask either one of us how we feel about it." She went out. Behind her, Absalom Creed sat for some minutes without moving, And then he took a sheet of company paper and wrote a note to the editor of the Harrow Bend Clarion, whose press he had paid for and whose newsprint he sold at cost, suggesting a humorous item for the local brevities column, and he sealed it. And he told himself, as men in his position always do, that it was only a bit of fun and would do no harm. The Clarion came out Thursday. Under local brevities, third item down, it said, "We are informed that Harrow Bend is to have an addition to its architecture. A lady lately arrived from Illinois, of ample proportions and ampler ambitions, has taken up the Gumbo Ridge north of town, and proposes to erect thereon a residence of the native material. The Clarion wishes her joy of it and suggests the name Brenner's Mud Cathedral. Visitors from the east are advised that it is not part of the town site and that the improvement company disclaims all connection. It was read aloud in both saloons. It was read aloud in the general store. Somebody cut it out and stuck it up with a pin behind the bar in the billiard hall. And it stayed up there through that summer and the winter after it, and it was still up there 14 months later, on the 16th of June of 1885, and afterward, when men came looking for that piece of paper, they could not find the wall it had been pinned to, nor the building, nor the street. She needed three things she did not have: a breaking plow, a team to pull it, and somebody to show her whether what she remembered about walls was true out here. She got all three from the same man, and she got him by accident on the 16th of April by walking 3 miles east along the river road to look at a house she had heard about. It belonged to a Norwegian named Ivar Lund, and it was 4 years old, and it was made of sod, and everybody in Harrow Bend agreed that it was the best-built dirt house in the valley, in the same tone of voice they would have used to say it was the best-smelling hog. She came up on it in the middle of the morning and stopped in the road and looked at it for 5 full minutes before she went any nearer, and what she was doing was reading it, the way a man who has spent his life around horses reads a horse across a field. It was 18 feet by 30. The walls were near enough 3 feet thick, and they were not straight up and down. They leaned in, very slightly, top narrower than the bottom, maybe 1.5 inches of batter to the foot. The corners were square, and they were bonded, the courses lapping alternately one way and then the other, so that no vertical joint ran up through more than one course. The window openings had frames set in them, with the sod laid tight against a beveled jamb, and above each opening there was a lintel of cottonwood plank with a course of sod laid crosswise on top of it to spread the load. The roof had a good pitch to it, better than most, and the eaves came out past the wall a full 18 inches, so the rain would drop clear instead of running down the face. And along the base of the wall, all the way round, there was a ditch about 1 foot deep and 2 feet out, sloped away. Hulda Brenner stood in the road with her hands on her hips and said, out loud, to nobody, "Well, look at that. He drains it." A voice behind her said, 4 years and she has not slumped 1 inch. He had come up the road with a team, and she had not heard him over the wind. He was about 36, very tall, with heavy sloping shoulders and sandy hair going gray at the temple and a short beard, and a face burned red across the cheekbones and white where his hat sat. He was in a collarless undershirt with suspenders and canvas trousers, and there was dry mud to his knees. She said, "You laid the batter with a plumb bob and a wedge." He stopped walking. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he came the rest of the way and stood beside her and looked at his own house with her, and he said, "With a stick so long, tied to the plumb line. If the line touches the stick end at the top, the wall is right." He held his hands apart to show a distance of about 1.5 inches. "My father is a mason in Norway. He built with stone. He would say this is not building. But he is in Norway, and I am here, and it is what there is. My father made brick," she said. 31 years. In Illinois. Ivar Lund turned his head and looked at her again, and it was the first look she had had from any man in Harrow Bend that was not about her size. It was frank curiosity, one tradesman to another, the look of a person who has just discovered there is somebody else in the county who knows what a wall is. Then he said, You know already the only thing that matters. Which is what? She said, to see if he would say it right. He said, the joint. Not the brick. The joint. She laughed out loud, and it startled a meadowlark up out of the grass, and she said, well, thank God. I have been in this county 8 days, and I was beginning to think I had imagined the whole trade. They talked for 2 hours standing in the road, and then another 2 sitting on the bench by his door with coffee, and by noon she had told him the whole of it. The letters and the platform and the scale and the tin box and the $14 and creed and the ridge, and he had listened without once making a face of pity, which she noticed and was grateful for. When she was done, he sat a while with his forearms on his knees. Then he said, the ridge is right. She said, tell me why. I want to hear it from somebody who has built. So he told her, and it took him 20 minutes, and it was the most useful 20 minutes of her life. The best sod in the world, he said, is old sod on high ground with short grass, buffalo grass and grama. Not slough grass, not the tall stuff on the bottom that is coarse and it has holes in it and it will fall apart in your hands in July. Short grass on a ridge that has never been broken has a mat of root 4 inches thick, and it is not soil at all, it is a woven thing. And under it, on the ridge, you have got the clay. That clay is why nobody will farm it, and that clay is why it will build. It has body. Bottom sod on the good corn ground is all loam and it crumbles. He held up a finger. And the ridge is dry, he said. This is the thing that kills a soddy, and it is not rain from the top that you can shed. It is water in the ground coming up into the wall from underneath. On the flat, water lies. On the ridge, water runs away and takes itself off down the slope. Every man in this valley builds his soddy in the low place by the creek because it is close to the water and it is out of the wind, and every one of those houses is soft in the bottom course in 3 years and slumped in 5. The Barclay soddy on the creek, you can put your thumb in that wall to the knuckle. Mine has been dry 4 years because I am on the second bench and I have got a ditch round it. She said, and the wind, up there. He shrugged with his whole upper body, the way Norwegians do. The wind, he said, is why you build thick and low, and you put your long side into it, and you do not build tall, and after that the wind is a thing for the roof, and not for the wall. Wind does not take a sod house. Wind takes the frame houses. He nodded down the valley in the direction of Harrow Bend with an expression she could not read at all. Those, in 1881, before your town, there was a wind in April took a barn on the Dismal River and put a plank through a cottonwood tree so it stood out both sides. A plank. Through a tree. She sat with her coffee going cold. Mr. Lund, she said, I have got $42, less what I have spent, and a good level, and a chalk line, and a folding rule, and 2 hands. I have not got a plow, or a team, or 1 day of experience in cutting sod. I am asking you a plain question, and I would like a plain answer, because I am too old and too tired for a polite one. Can a woman alone build a house out of this ground before the winter? Ivar Lund thought about it seriously. That was the thing about him, she came to learn, that he thought about a question for as long as the question deserved, and not 1 second less to be agreeable. Alone, no, he said at last. Not because you are a woman, because the wall goes to 5 foot, and above 5 foot a sod brick weighs 50 pounds wet, and you must lift it above your shoulder and set it down soft, not drop it, and 1 person cannot lift and set and hold the line all at once. 2 people can. 2 people can build the whole house. He drank his coffee. I have a 14-inch breaking plow, he said, and 4 horses, and my own breaking is done on the 11th of May. Before that I cannot. After that I can give you days. I will not take your money, because you have not got any, and I will take it later when you have, and I will not argue about it now. She opened her mouth. And he said, and this is not kindness, so do not thank me. I have watched 4 families go back east this year out of that town, because they could not carry a lumber note. If a woman puts up a good sod house on that ridge where every train can see it, and it stands, and it is warm in January and cool in July, and it costs her nothing but her back, then there are 11 families in this valley who will look at it. That is worth more to me than a day's work." He set the cup down. "Also," he said, "I have wanted for 4 years to say the word joint to somebody and have them know what I meant." She stayed 2 more hours, and he showed her the inside of the house, the muslin stretched under the roof to catch the dirt, the whitewashed walls, the deep windowsills you could sit a child in. The way the room was 58 degrees at noon in the middle of April, with no fire in the stove, and she put her hand flat on the inside of the wall and felt how it was neither cold nor warm, but simply still, and she understood a thing about the next 50 years of her life. She walked home the 3 miles into the wind with a penciled list in her apron pocket in a big square Norwegian hand, and it said, "Grasshopper plow 14 in, cut 4 in deep, no deeper. Sod cut in strips, chop 30 in long with sharp spade. Do not cut sod wet, do not cut sod dry. Cut 2 days after rain. Grass side down, every joint broken, every third course crosswise. Batter 1 1/2 inch to the foot. Willow in the wall at the openings. Wall 3 feet at the bottom. Ridgepole cedar, cut in canyon, 25 foot, 6-inch top. Roof pole brush, hay 4-inch clay sod grass up. Eaves out 18-inch. Ditch at the bottom underlined twice he had written, 1 acre of good sod builds 1 house. You have got 160. Between the 16th of April and the 11th of May, when Ivar Lund's own breaking would be finished and his plow would come free. Hulda Brenner had 25 days and nothing to build with. She did not waste them. The first thing she did was solve the problem of where she slept, because a woman cannot establish residence on a claim from a church bench, and because Reverend Stubbs's wife, who was kind and exhausted and had a baby with colic, had begun to have a look about her. She solved it with the dugout. Orrin Hale's dugout was on his quarter, and his quarter now stood filed to Del Hale, and she had no more right to be in it than a badger. But a burned-out hole in a bank is not a residence, and nobody was living in it, and Del Hale was 3 miles off at his own place, and she reasoned that the worst that could happen was that she would be told to go. So on the 17th she walked out with a borrowed shovel and cleaned 6 inches of ash and charred pole out of the floor of it, and pried the burned ridge pole out, and cut 4 willow poles from the creek, and laid them across the top, and over them she put brush and hay, and 8 inches of dirt, and she hung the doorway with a piece of wagon sheet the depot agent's wife gave her. And she slept in it that night on hay with her coat over her. It took her 3 days to do what a man might have done in a day and a half. She was not fast. She had never been fast. She stopped often, and she sat down on the bank when her heart went hard in her chest, and she got up again. What she had instead of speed was that she did not stop coming back, and that when she did a thing, she did it once. On the 4th night Del Hale rode up and sat his horse outside the dugout in the dark and told her to get out of his brother's hole in the ground. She came up out of it and stood in the doorway with the lamp behind her. "I will be gone off it by the middle of June," she said. "I am building on my own quarter, and the day I have got a roof I am under it. You can turn me out tonight if you want, and I will go, and I will sleep on my own ground under a wagon sheet, and every soul in Harrow Bend will know by Sunday that Orrin Hale's brother put a woman out of a burned dugout in April. Or you can leave me be for 8 weeks, and nobody will ever hear a word about it from me." Del Hale sat there a while. Then he said, "My brother was a fool for women," and turned his horse. But he did not turn her out. The second thing she did in those 25 days was earn money, because $14 had gone to the land office, and $4.40 to the railroad, and $1.80 to the hardware for a spade, a good one, a long-handled, square-mouthed spade she filed to an edge every second evening, and she was down to $19 and change. There was a railroad section gang of 11 men working the grade east of town that spring. They lived in 2 boxcars on a siding, and they were filthy in the way that only railroad men living in boxcars can be, and the woman who had been doing their wash had quit in March. Huldah walked out to the siding on the 21st of April and made a bargain with the foreman, 11 men, shirts and drawers and socks, once a week, $4.50 the week, and she would come and get it and bring it back. It was brutal work. It was worse than the building would be. She hauled water from the creek in 2 buckets on a neck yoke, 60 gallons a week, and boiled it in a kettle over an open fire in front of the dugout, and scrubbed on a board with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her forearms red to the bone from lye, and hung it on a line strung between 2 willow stakes, where the Nebraska wind dried it in 90 minutes and filled it with grit. She did it every Tuesday and Wednesday, from 4 in the morning until dark. It brought in $18 a month, which was more cash money than most of the homesteaders in that valley saw in a season, and she was never once ashamed of it, and she used to say afterward that the railroad built her house, in the sense that 11 men's underdrawers paid for the nails. The third thing she did was find Nettie Fay Pike, or rather, Nettie Fay Pike found her. She was 19. She was married to a man named Hollis Pike, who had come out from Missouri with a wagon and a mortgage and had put up a company house on a lot in town on Creed's credit and was in it for $240 and had a claim 8 miles out he could not get to often enough to hold. Nettie Fay was as thin as a fence wire, with light brown hair in a braid and a pink calico dress washed nearly white, and she had lost a baby in February and had not, her husband said, been herself since. She turned up at the dugout on the 24th of April in the middle of the afternoon with no explanation whatsoever, walked up to the wash fire, picked a shirt out of the rinse water, wrung it, and pegged it on the line. Huldah straightened up with her hands dripping and looked at her. Nettie Fay Pike said, "I read the piece in the paper." "Did you?" said Huldah. "It said Mud Cathedral," she said. "My mother is dead, and my baby is dead, and I have got nothing to do in that town all day but sit in a house I do not own and listen to Mrs. Creed talk about the Improvement Society. And I have never in my life seen a woman tell Absalom Creed no. Mr. Pike says I ought not come out here." She pegged up another shirt. "So I come out here." That was the whole of the interview. She was there at daylight the next morning, and she was there most days for the next 2 years. The fourth thing Huldah did, and the thing that mattered most, was that she designed the house. She did it on the back of the Clarion that had the joke in it, and on 4 sheets of butcher paper, and then finally, when she had it right, in pencil in the front and back covers of her mother's Bible, because paper cost money and the Bible was going to be in the house anyway. She did not design a soddy the way soddies were built in that county, which was to say a room, 4 walls, a hole for a door, and however many holes for windows the man got tired of cutting. She designed it the way a brickyard designs a kiln, which is to say she started from the loads and worked outward. 16 feet by 32 on the inside, long axis running east and west so that the long north wall took the winter wind on its length and the wind slid off it, and so that the south wall got the low winter sun into 2 deep windows. Walls 3 feet thick at the base, battered in 1.5 inches to the foot, so that at 7 feet of height the wall was 2 feet 2 inches thick at the top. That batter was the thing nobody else in the county bothered with, and it was worth more than everything else put together, because a battered wall leans its weight in on itself, and a plumb wall does not. Corners bonded, and every third course laid crosswise, header courses, exactly the way her father bonded a kiln wall, and she knew from him what a header course does, which is to tie the 2 faces of a thick wall into one wall instead of 2 thin ones leaning on each other. 2 willow poles laid the full length of the wall in the 4th course, and again in the 8th, embedded in the sod like reinforcing, which was her own idea, and which she got from watching her father set iron ties in a brick chimney, and which Ivar Lund had never seen anybody do and thought about for a long minute before he said, "Yes, yes, do that." An inside wall, a partition, sod 2 feet thick, running north and south a third of the way along, dividing off a bedroom, and that partition was not for privacy. She put it there because a wall 32 feet long with nothing bracing it in the middle is a wall waiting for a reason, and a cross wall in the middle turns 2 long walls into 4 short ones. And a roof with a real pitch, not the 4-inch to the footshed slope most Saudis had that shed water badly and had to be re-dirtied every spring. She drew 7 inches to the foot with a proper ridge and rafters both sides, which meant she needed a 25-foot ridge pole and 18 rafter poles, and there was not a cedar within 11 miles of Harrow Bend. That, she wrote in the margin of the Bible, is the whole of the problem. Everything else is only lifting. The cedar was in the canyons of the Dismal, 22 miles southwest, in the broken country where the sand hills fall away into a set of steep little box canyons with springs in the bottom, and there were red cedars in there 60 and 80 years old that had never been cut, because getting a wagon in and out of those canyons was a 2-day proposition, and a man could buy a pine pole off the flat car for $1.40. Holder Brenner could not buy a pine pole off the flat car. The flat cars belonged to Absalom Creed. So, on the 28th of April, she went to see 3 men in one morning. The first was the depot agent, Purvis, and she asked him a question nobody had ever asked him, which was whether the railroad ever sold anything besides freight. He blinked at her, and then he said, "Well, we sell the culls. Ties that come in checked or shook, we can't lay them, and they stack up back of the section house, and they get burned twice a year." She bought 11 cull ties at 8 cents apiece. 88 cents. They were 7 feet of oak, cracked but sound, and they would become her door frame, her window frames, her lintels, and the sill plate under her ridgepole, and Absalom Creed never sold her one board, and she never once had to ask him. The second man was the blacksmith, a German named Kroll, who spoke little English and had a shop full of the smell of hot iron and hoof. She brought him her father's brick hammer and had him draw the head out and re-steel it into a sod knife, a thing like a short heavy machete with a squared-off end, and she had him make her a second spade edge and 4 iron dogs and a 16-inch PV hook. $2.10 and a shirt she mended for his wife. The third man was Ivar Lund, and she did not ask him for anything which she had learned was the way to get the most from him. She rode out with Nettie Fay in the Pike's borrowed cart and told him what she meant to do about the ridgepole, which was to go to the Dismal with a hired team and cut it herself. He listened, and then he said, "When?" "The 1st of May," she said, "and I will have Mrs. Pike and I have hired Hollis Pike's team for $2 because he is glad of the $2. Ivar Lund said, "Hollis Pike could not find that canyon with a map and a dog." "I will go." They went on the 1st of May, and they were gone 5 days, and it was, she said later, the hardest 5 days of the whole business, and the ones she was fondest of. 3 of them, and 2 wagons, 22 miles out through the sandhills, where the road stopped being a road after 9 miles and became a set of wheel marks going around the shoulders of grass-covered dunes, and where the wagon sank to the hub twice, and they unloaded it both times and carried the load forward by hand and dragged the empty wagon out. Huldah carried her share. She carried more than her share, because a 100-pound sack of grub and tools is a thing you carry with your legs and your back, and she had a great deal of both. And it was on the second afternoon, hauling on a rope with her heels dug into loose sand and the wagon coming up out of a blowout an inch at a time, that Ivar Lund said, to nobody in particular, in Norwegian, a sentence Nettie Fay made him translate that evening. He had said, "This one is strong like the North Country." They found the canyon on the evening of the second day. It was a green crack in a brown world, 300 yards long, with a spring at the head of it and a little run of clear water going down through watercress and cedars standing up the sides of it, black-grain and shaggy. And it was so beautiful and so unexpected after 11 hours of grass that Nettie Fay Pike sat down on the wagon tongue and cried, and neither of the others said one word about it, and in about 4 minutes she got up and started unhitching. They cut for 2 days. They cut one ridgepole, 27 feet long and 8 inches at the butt and 5.5 at the top, out of a cedar Ivar picked on the third try after rejecting 2 for spiral grain. They cut 18 rafter poles, 16 feet, 4-inch tops. They cut 22 purlins and 30 smaller poles for the door and windows and the loft. They peeled everything, because bark holds beetles and damp, and peeling is done with a draw knife and a curved stroke, and it is monotonous and it takes hours. And Hulda peeled with her back against a rock and the sun on her and her hands going stiff, and by the end of the second day she could not close her right hand all the way and did not mention it. Getting the ridgepole out of the canyon took 4 hours. They could not get a wagon down. They rigged a snatch block on a standing cedar at the head of the draw and ran a rope through it and brought the pole up the slope with both teams and 3 people levering. And about halfway the pole hung on a root, and the near horse went down on his knees, and Ivar shouted something, and Hulda, who was on the peavey, threw her whole weight against the butt end and rolled it 2 feet sideways. And off the root, and the pole came free with a noise like a gunshot and went up the slope, and Ivar Lund stood there with the reins in his hand and looked at her and said, very quietly, "Gud bevare meg." Loaded, the ridgepole hung 11 feet out past the tail of the wagon, and they made 9 miles the 4th day and 13 the 5th. And they came into the Middle Loop Valley on the evening of the 5th of May with 2 wagons stacked with peeled cedar and every soul in Harrow Bend out on the street to watch them come down the town road, because the wagons had to pass the length of it to get to the ford. That was the first day the town looked at her without laughing, and the reason was very simple and had nothing to do with respect. It was that everybody there could count, and 18 peeled rafter poles and a 27-foot ridge cedar was $50 of timber lying in those wagons, and they had all been told for 3 weeks that the fat woman on the ridge had nothing. Absalom Creed came out of the yard office and stood at the gate with his hands behind his back and watched the wagons go by. He did not speak. Hulda Brenner, walking beside the second wagon because she had ridden as little as she could to spare the team, looked at him as she passed and touched her bonnet brim with 2 fingers exactly the way a teamster does, and went on. Behind her, one of the men on the loading dock laughed, and Creed turned around, and the laugh stopped in the middle. They stacked the timber on the ridge on the 6th of May, up on skids off the ground and covered with old hay, and Ivar Lund went home to finish his breaking, and Hulda Brenner sat down that night in the mouth of the burned dugout with her hands wrapped in rags and her back one long ache from the neck to the knee, and she got out her mother's Bible, and she wrote in the back cover. Under the drawing, in pencil, May 6. Timber on the ground. 11 ties. 1 ridge, 18 raft, 22 purlin, 30 small. Spent to date 26.13, have 33.87, and the wash money coming. Plow the 11th. Wall by June 1 if the rain holds off. Hands bad. They will harden. And then, lower down, in a different and smaller hand, as though she were not entirely willing to write it, he said strong like the North Country. I have been called a great many things in 28 years, and that is a new one. It rained on the 9th of May, 1 1/10, a soft, steady rain out of the southeast that came in the night and quit at noon the next day. And it was the best thing that happened to her that spring, though she spent the whole of it lying in a dugout listening to water come through her roof onto her mother's Bible, which she had wrapped in wagon sheet and put in the tin box. 2 days after a rain, Ivar Lund's list said. Not wet, not dry. 2 days after, the plow came up the ridge road at 6 in the morning on the 11th of May behind 4 horses, and it was a 14-inch breaking plow with a rolling coulter and a long, low moldboard, the kind they called a grasshopper plow because the beam came out over the wheel like a leg, and the share on it had been ground the night before until it shone like a knife. The way you cut sod is this, and it is worth knowing because almost nobody alive now has watched it done. You set the plow to run 4 inches deep, not 5, not 3. 3, and the strip breaks up in the middle when you lift it, because there is not enough soil under the mat of root to hold it together. 5, and the brick is too heavy for a person to lift onto a wall above their shoulder, and it will crack across the middle from its own weight when it is picked up. 4. You run your furrow long and straight, and the moldboard on a breaking plow does not turn the strip over the way a stubble plow does. It cuts it loose and lays it over flat, one continuous ribbon of prairie 14 inches wide, unrolling behind the plow like a bolt of carpet coming off the counter. You go the length of your ground and turn and come back on the same line, and behind you the whole ridge lies stripped in ribbons. Then you take a sharp spade and you walk that ribbon and you chop it into bricks 30 inches long, and you chop straight down and hard in one stroke, because 2 strokes makes a ragged end, and a ragged end makes a bad joint. And then you carry them. That is the part nobody tells you about. A 14 by 30 by 4-inch brick of wet Nebraska prairie weighs between 40 and 55 pounds. A house 16 by 32 with 3-foot walls, 7 feet high, and a partition takes, by Huldah Brenner's own count, kept in the Bible in tally marks, 3,140 of them. They started at the east end of the ridge, on the crown, 41 rods north of the Platte line and 11 rods east of the corner stake, and Ivar Lund drove the first furrow at 6:20 in the morning on the 11th of May, and Huldah Brenner walked behind him with the spade, and Nettie Fay Pike came out from town at 7 with a jug of buttermilk and a hoe. They cut sod for 2 days and stacked it in low piles to keep it off the ground, and on the 13th they laid the first course. She had staked the outline with the chalk line and the willow pegs, and she had dug a shallow trench for the first course, 8 inches down to firm ground, and leveled the bottom of it with the spade and the brass bubbled level that had been her father's, going along a foot at a time, scraping and checking and scraping for 3 hours, which everyone who watched agreed was a foolish waste of a morning, and which was the reason that house was still standing in 1929. Then she knelt down at the northeast corner, and she said out loud in her father's words, "God help the work," and she laid the first sod break grass side down. Grass side down. That is the whole secret, and it is not a secret at all. It is just that half the men in that county were in too big a hurry. Grass side down means the root mat, the tough woven part, is on the bottom of the brick, in contact with the flat of the brick beneath it, root against soil, and in 3 weeks the roots of the upper brick grow down into the soil of the lower one, and the 2 bricks become one thing. A sod wall laid grass side down does not dry into a stack. It knits. By August you could not have found the joints in Huldah Brenner's north wall with a knife. They laid 3 courses the first day, and both women's arms shook that night. They laid 4 the second day, and 5 the third, and after that they had the rhythm of it, and they averaged 5 a day when the sod held, and none when it rained. Huldah laid every brick on the wall herself. That was not pride, though there was some in it. It was that laying is a judgment and carrying is a labor, and there was only one person on that ridge who had grown up watching a man lay up a kiln wall. Nettie Fay carried and chopped and fetched. Ivar Lund came on the days he could, 4 days in May and 6 in June, and when he came he did the 2 things she could not, which were to drive the plow and to lift onto the high courses. And on every course, at every corner, she checked the batter with a plumb line and a stick, and she checked the level with her father's level, and she broke every joint, and every 3rd course she turned the bricks crosswise to tie the wall through, and she kept the tally in the Bible in blocks of 10. The town came out to watch, not the first week. The first week they only talked about it. But by the 20th of May there was a wall 2 feet high and 100 feet around standing on the crown of that ridge where every train could see it, and people began to make the ride out in the evening the way people do, and by the last week of May there were 6 or 8 buggies out on the ridge road most fine evenings, standing off at a distance the way you stand at a fence to watch a house burn. She never once told them to go away. She used to say afterward that she got some of her best sod out of that, because at least 4 of the men who came out to laugh ended up with their coats off. That was the thing she understood about a wall going up that nobody at the improvement company ever understood in their lives. A wall going up is the most powerful thing there is for pulling a man off a fence. He can stand there 20 minutes making remarks. Then he sees the woman lift a 50-pound brick to her shoulder for the 400th time that day. And he sees that the corner is dead square and the courses are running true and the top of that wall is as flat as a table across 100 feet. And something in him that his mother put there gets up and walks over and picks up the other end. The first was a boy of 17 named Otho Rennick who worked for the livery. And he came out on a Sunday and worked till dark and came every Sunday after. The second was Kroll the blacksmith, who did not talk, and who came 3 evenings and looked at the corner bond for a long time, and then went home and came back the next evening with 4 iron dogs he had made unasked for pinning the willow ties, and would not take a cent. And the third, on the 2nd of June, was Del Hale, and that came about a different way. On the 31st of May, somebody let stock into the sod stacks. She came up in the morning and found 40 head of range cattle standing in the middle of 11 days' cut sod, and they had walked it and lain on it and broken it up, and there were 600 bricks ruined, 4 days of work, and the wire on the temporary fence had not broken. It had been unstapled from 3 posts and rolled back neat and laid on the ground. Nettie Fay Pike sat down in the grass and cried, and then got up and started sorting out what could be saved. Hulda Brenner did not cry and did not go to town and did not accuse anybody. She walked the fence and looked at the staples, which had been drawn with a proper claw and not twisted out, and she looked at the tracks. And then she went and got the plow and put the 4 horses to it herself for the first time, alone, and she broke ground for 2 hours until her hands bled through the rags, and she cut new sod. Ivar Lund came the next day and found her at it and said one word, which was who. And she said, "I do not know, and I am not going to find out, because if I find out I will have a war with a neighbor for 20 years, and I have got a house to build." He looked at her for a while, and then he took the lines out of her hands. But somebody in town found out, because a town always does. And on the 2nd of June, in the middle of the afternoon, Del Hale rode up the ridge alone with a spade across the saddle in front of him and got down and stood there. Hulda straightened up on the wall with a brick in her arms. "It was not me," he said. "All right," she said. "It was Ott Sanderson and the Barclay Hand," he said. "They was drunk, and they was put up to it, and they was paid $2 each, and I am not going to say by who, because I cannot prove it, and neither can you." "All right," she said again. Del Hale looked at the wall. It was 5 courses up, and 40 feet of the north side had the willow ties showing in the 4th course like the ribs of a boat, and the corner where he stood was so square you could have set a plumb bob on it. "My brother," he said, and then stopped. She waited. She had gotten very good at waiting. "He wrote me at Christmas," Del Hale said, "that he had wrote to a woman in Illinois, and she had wrote back a letter that had the price of nails in it. He said that was how he knew. He said any woman can write about her feelings, but this one has priced nails in Freeport and put it in a letter to a stranger so he would know what he was getting." He put the spade point down in the dirt. "I have been ugly to you," he said, "and I am not going to make a speech about it, and I am not withdrawing my filing on his quarter neither, because it is mine by blood, and I mean to have it. But I will give you 8 days on this wall, and I will not take pay." He gave her 11. The walls topped out at 7 feet 1 inch on the 14th of June, and there were 4 people on the ridge to see it: Hulda Brenner, Nettie Fay Pike, Ivar Lund, and Del Hale, and the boy Otho Rennick, who had come out on his dinner hour and stayed. The last brick went on the west gable at 10 minutes past 5 in the afternoon. Nobody made a speech. Hulda said it, and tapped it twice with the flat of her hand the way her father used to tap the last brick of a kiln arch. And then she sat down on the top of the wall with her legs hanging inside the house that was not a house yet, and looked at what they had made. 104 feet of wall, 3 feet thick at the bottom, 2'2" at the top. 3,140 bricks, and every one of them lifted by hand, and about 2,000 of them lifted by her. The gable ends she had built up in sod, stepping the courses in on the batter until they came to a point, and she had set the sill blocks for the ridge pole in the top of each gable, with 2 cull oak ties laid crosswise under them to spread the bearing. And that detail was pure brickyard, pure Caspar Brenner of Freeport, Illinois. And it is why that ridge did not settle a half-inch in 5 years. Getting the ridge pole up was the worst hour of the summer. 27 feet of green cedar, 8 inches at the butt, weighing something over 500 pounds, and it had to go from the ground to the top of a 7-foot gable, and there was no crane in the county, and there was not going to be one. They did it the way it had been done since Babylon, with a ramp and a rope and patience. 2 skid poles up the outside of the east gable. A snatch block lashed at the ridge of the west gable to a sheer leg, made of 2 rafter poles crossed and footed in the wall. Ivor's 4 horses on the rope at 40 yards. Dell on the near skid with a peavy, Otho on the far one, Nettie Fay at the horses' heads, and Hulda Brenner at the butt end with her shoulder under it and her boots braced against the wall. Because she was the heaviest person there, and because when a 500-pound pole starts to come back down the hill at you, what you want at the bottom of it is weight. It went up 8 feet and stopped and hung, and one of the skids sprang. And Ivar shouted hold, and the horses stood, and for about 9 seconds the whole thing rested on the 2 women, on Nettie Fay's hands on the bridles and on Hulda's shoulder. And then Dell got his peavy under it and rolled it a quarter turn onto the good skid, and it went the rest of the way up and dropped into its notch with a sound like a door closing. Ivar Lund walked the length of the wall, looking up at it, and he said, "That is not a settler's house. That is a barn frame in a church wall." They set the 18 rafters over the next 2 days, notched into the ridge and footed on the wall plate. 7 inches of fall to the foot, and over the rafters they laid the purlins, and over the purlins 2 feet of willow, brush-cut green from the creek, laid crossways and lapped like thatch. Over the brush, 8 inches of loose prairie hay. Over the hay, 4 inches of the ridge's own clay, spread and tamped with the back of a spade, and tamped again, and wetted and tamped a 3rd time, until it was a solid pan. And on top of it all, sod, grass side up this time. 300 more bricks carried up a ladder one at a time, laid tight, joints broken, so that the roof of that house was a piece of unbroken living prairie 4 inches thick, lying on 4 inches of clay, lying on 8 inches of hay. They finished the roof on the 19th of June, and it rained on the 20th, 2 hours of it, and the inside of the house stayed dry as a biscuit tin. And Hulda Brenner stood in the middle of her own floor, with the rain going on over her head, and made a sound that Nettie Fay Pike described afterward as somewhere between a laugh and a cough, and then had to sit down on a nail keg for a minute. The eaves came out 18 inches all round on projecting purlin ends, so that the drip fell clear of the wall. The ditch went in that week, a foot deep and 2 feet out, sloped away all the way round. She dug most of it herself. Then came the month of the small things, which is the month nobody sings about. She set the 4 window frames out of cull oak, beveled the sod jambs in against them, and glazed 2 of them with real glass, 4 lights each. Bought at the hardware for $3.40, and covered the other 2 with oiled muslin until October, when she could afford glass. She hung a door of 2-inch oak plank on strap hinges Kroll made her. And Kroll would not take money for the hinges either, and she put a peck of wild plums on his wife's step in August, and they were square. She laid a floor. Not boards. She could not afford boards. She laid a clay floor the way her father would have laid a kiln hearth, 6 inches of the ridge clay, tamped in 3 lifts, then wetted with a wash of clay and ox blood from the butcher in town, then tamped again, then dried slow under wet sacks for 11 days, then oiled. It came up the color of dark honey and hard enough to wring under a boot heel, and it swept like a plate, and women who came into that house in later years used to kneel down and put their hands flat on it. She stretched muslin across under the rafters, tacked to the purlins to make a ceiling and catch the dirt that sifts down out of any dirt roof. Bought in town, 31 yards, $2.20. She whitewashed the inside walls with lime, 4 coats. And when the 4th coat went on, the room came up so bright that Nettie Faye stood in the door and said, "Oh," out loud, because a whitewashed sod room with 2 south windows in it in June is one of the brightest rooms a person can stand in, and it is nothing on God's earth like the photographs they print in Ohio. She built a stove platform of the last cull tie and set up the little sheet iron stove she bought second-hand from the section foreman for $4 and ran the pipe out through the west gable with a sheet metal thimble Kroll cutter, because she was not going to run a stovepipe out through her roof. And on the last day, the 4th of July of 1884, while the town of Harrow Bend was a mile away firing anvils and listening to a lawyer from Grand Island talk about the destiny of the American West, Huldah Brenner climbed a ladder onto her own roof with a tin can and walked the ridge of it, broadcasting sunflower seed and grama seed by hand into the sod, because the roof was going to grow something whether she chose it or not, and she preferred to. Choose. Her total expenditure on the house, kept in the Bible in a column, came to $31.84. The Cosmopolitan Hotel at the head of Main Street in Harrow Bend, finished 11 days later, cost the improvement company $9,200. She moved in on the 6th of July. She had a bed frame of poles with rope lacing and a haytick. A table Kroll's boy made her out of the last 2 cull ties, 2 chairs, the sheet iron stove, a shelf of 11 books, the cased daguerreotype of her mother and father in front of the brickyard office, and the brass-bound trunk, which she put under the south window with a cloth on it and used as a bench for the next 30 years. She had, as of the 6th of July, $9.11. She was, as of the 6th of July, one of perhaps 4 people in the county of any sex whose home was owned free and clear of Absalom Creed. There was a housewarming of a sort. 6 people came. Ivor Lund brought a bucket of whitewashed lime and a smoked ham. Nettie Faye and Hollis Pike came, and Hollis, who had said his wife ought not go out there, walked around the inside twice with his hat in his hand and came back and stood in front of the north wall and put his palm on it and said, in a voice that had something wrong with it, "We are paying $240 for a house you can hear the wind through." Reverend Stubbs came with his wife and a baby and said a prayer over the doorway that was mercifully short. Del Hale came and would not sit down and left after 20 minutes. And Barnabas Quint came, 61 miles from Grand Island on his own time and his own money, because he had a daughter with a claim in Custer County, and he stood in the middle of that whitewashed room with his hat in his hands and turned all the way round twice, and then he said something Huldah Brenner never forgot. He said, "Miss Brenner, I have registered 11,000 entries in that office. About half of them get a house. About 1/10 of those get a house that outlives the man who built it." He put his hat on. "You have got a house that will outlive the town," he said. He meant it as a figure of speech. It was the 4th of August, 1884. He had 10 months and 12 days to wait to be literally correct. The trouble with a house that costs $31 is that it is an argument, and arguments get answered. The answer came on the 2nd of September, 1884, in the form of a printed notice served on her by the sheriff of the county, who rode out to the ridge to do it, and who was so plainly miserable about it that she gave him coffee. It was a contest. Under the land laws, a man could contest another man's entry by swearing that the entryman had failed in the requirements. And if he made it good, he got a preference right to file on the land himself. The contestant was a man named Emery Sanderson, brother of the Aunt Sanderson who had unstapled her fence, and the affidavit alleged 3 things: that the entrywoman had not established actual bona fide residence, that she had made no improvement of value, and that the entry had been made not for a home but for speculative purposes, to wit, to obstruct the natural growth of the town of Harrow Bend and to compel the purchase of her right at an extortionate figure. That last allegation is the one that told her who had written it, because Ott Sanderson could not have spelled obstruct, and Emery could not have spelled either of them. The hearing was set for the 20th of October at the land office at Grand Island. She had 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks she did 4 things, and every one of them was the kind of thing a brickyard teaches and a courtroom does not. First, she wrote out an account of her residence, day by day, from the 6th of July, and she did not write it from memory. She had the Bible. She had every day's work and every day's spending set down in the back cover and in the second little book she had started in July, and she copied it out fair. Nights slept in the house, 92 of 92. She had not been off that ridge one night since the day she moved onto it. Second, she got witnesses, and she got the right ones, not her friends. She had learned something about how the world weighs testimony, and she knew that Nettie Faye Pike loved her and that a hearing officer would see that in 9 seconds. So she asked Barnabas Quint, who declined because he was an officer of the very office and could not, and who then told her in the most carefully neutral voice a man ever used, that of course the register was obliged to consider affidavits from any disinterested person of good standing, particularly persons who had no connection whatever to either party, and that in his long experience nothing carried like a man who plainly did not want to be there. So she asked Purvis, the depot agent, who kept a daily log of everything that moved in that valley, and who could swear from it that she had bought 11 cull ties on the 28th of April, and had hauled cedar in on the 5th of May, and had come to the depot for her wash bundles every Tuesday since the 21st of April, which put her in the county continuously. She asked Kroll, the blacksmith, who did not want to come, who said in his short English that he had a shop and customers and Mr. Creed bought his coal, and who came anyway and stood up in that room in a clean shirt and said 11 words. And she asked, on the 11th of October, standing at his gate with her hands folded, Del Hale. He said no. She said, all right, and turned to go, and got 15 feet down the road, and he said, wait, because Del Hale had spent the summer in a condition he could not name. He had filed on his brother's quarter, and he had gotten it, and he was living in it, and he had plowed his brother's furrows and drunk out of his brother's well, and about once a week all summer he had ridden past a ridge where a woman his brother had chosen out of a Chicago newspaper was building, with her own back, out of dirt, a house better than any his family had ever owned on either side of the Mississippi. He said, what do I have to say? She said, only what you saw. Nothing else. You do not have to say one kind word about me, and I would rather you did not. The third thing she did was the shrewdest. She had the improvement appraised. The contest alleged no improvement of value. So she rode to Grand Island in September at a cost of $4.40 she did not have, and she went to a builder, an honest fat old bohemian named Sedlacek, who put up brick storefronts. And she paid him $3 to come out on the cars and look at her house and write down what it would cost to hire it built. He spent 2 hours on that ridge. He measured the wall thickness and whistled. He got down on his knees on the clay floor and rapped it with his knuckles. He climbed a ladder and looked at the roof and came down and said something in Czech and then said in English, 4-inch clay, and who told you to do that? My father, she said. He made brick in Freeport. Sedlacek wrote out his estimate in a clerk's hand and signed it and had it notarized in town, and it said that the structure on the northwest quarter of Section 18 comprised 104 lineal feet of masonry wall averaging 30 inches in thickness and 7 feet in height, a partition wall of 24-inch section, a framed and poled roof of 211 square yards laid up with clay and turf, a tamped clay floor of 512 square feet, 4 framed openings and 1 hung door, and that to construct the same by hired labor at prevailing wages, exclusive of materials, would cost the sum of $485. $485. which was $191 more than Absalom Creed had quoted her for a frame house, delivered, the fourth thing she did was the one that finished it, and it happened by accident 9 days before the hearing. She was in the land office at Grand Island paying for a certified copy of her own entry papers when a clerk, not Quint, pulled the township plat to check a description for her, and she looked at it upside down across the counter the way she had looked at plats all her life, and she saw a pencil line on it that had not been there in April. It ran north out of the town site of Harrow Bend across the flat and up over the crown of the ridge and out the north side of her quarter section, and it was labeled in a neat draughtsman's hand, Proposed County Road, petition filed Aug 11, 1884. Right through the middle of her house, not near it. Through it. The center line of that proposed road, scaled off the plat with the rule she carried in her apron pocket every day of her life, passed within 9 feet of her north wall, which meant that the 66-foot right-of-way took her house, her door, her ditch, and the ground her stove sat on. A county road, once petitioned by the requisite number of freeholders and laid out by the commissioners, takes what it takes. There is compensation for improvements. The compensation is assessed by 3 appraisers appointed by the commissioners. 2 of the 3 commissioners of that county in 1884 were shareholders in the Harrow Bend Improvement Company. She stood at that counter for a full minute with her hands flat on the wood. Then she said, in a perfectly level voice, "May I have a certified copy of this plat as well, please?" And what would that cost? 75 cents. She paid it. At the hearing on the 20th of October, the contestant's attorney, a young man from Grand Island with a very good coat, put on his case in 50 minutes. He argued that the entry woman was not a farmer and had never turned a furrow for a crop, that she had no stock, that she made her living by taking in washing from a railroad gang, which was not agriculture, that her so-called improvement was a heap of turf worth nothing whatever on the market, and that her true design was plainly to sit astride the natural line of the town's growth and hold it up. Then Huldah Brenner, who could not afford an attorney, stood up in a gray calico dress with her hands folded in front of her and answered him in 11 minutes. She said she had slept 92 of 92 nights on the land, and here was the book, day by day. She said she had broken 4 acres and put in a garden of 11 kinds and had 200 pounds of potatoes in her cellar hole, and here was the seed bill. She said that as to her improvement being worth nothing on the market, here was the sworn and notarized estimate of a master builder of Grand Island, and would the register be so kind as to read the last line of it aloud. The register read the last line of it aloud. There was a certain quality of silence in the room. And then she said, on the matter of my design, and she laid the certified plat on the table and turned it around so the register could see it and put her finger on the pencil line. She said, the gentleman says, I took this ground to sit astride the growth of the town. Sir, on the 11th of August, 6 weeks after I moved into my house, a petition was filed to run a county road through my north wall. Not around the ridge, which is easier ground and half a mile shorter. Through the wall. I am the one being sat astride, and the wagon is not mine. The hearing lasted a little over 3 hours. The decision came down on the 11th of November, contest dismissed, entry sustained, costs to the contestant. The road petition died in the commissioner's room in December without ever coming to a vote, because a thing like that only works in the dark, and it was not in the dark anymore. And on the day after the decision, Absalom Creed crossed the street in Harrow Bend to avoid meeting her, which was, in a town 2 blocks long, a public event. The winter settled it for 11 families, and the cyclone only settled it for the rest. The first cold came on the 8th of November, and the valley froze hard the week after, and by the 1st of December Harrow Bend had learned what a Nebraska January is going to be like, which is a thing no amount of Eastern advertising ever prepared a soul for. Those improvement company houses were built to a pattern, and the pattern was a lie. 1 thickness of drop siding on 2x4 studding, building paper if the settler paid for it, and most did not. One thickness of shiplap inside and nothing at all in between but 4 inches of moving air. In Ohio, where the pattern came from, that is a house. In Nebraska, at 22 degrees below zero with a 40-mile wind that has come 600 miles across open ground without meeting anything taller than a fence post, that is a windbreak with a stove in it. Hollis Pike burned $9 of Creed's coal in December in a house he owed Creed $240 for, and on the coldest night of that month, the water in the kettle on the back of his stove froze while the stove was lit. Out on the ridge, in a house made of dirt, Huldah Brenner burned a bushel and a half of corn cobs and twisted hay a day, which cost her nothing whatever, and the coldest her room ever got that winter was 41 degrees at 6 in the morning with the fire dead out, and by 8 it was 68 and she had the door open for air. 3 feet of sod is 3 feet of sod. It does not care what the wind is doing. The wind can howl at a wall like that for 100 years, and all it will ever do is polish it. She had visitors that winter. That is how it started. A man would come out on some errand to buy a setting of eggs or to bring a bundle for the wash, and he would come in out of a wind that had been trying to peel his face off for 2 miles, and the door would shut behind him, and he would stand in the middle of a warm, bright, whitewashed room with muslin overhead and a clay floor under him and 2 south windows full of low winter sun. And the first thing every single one of them did, without exception, was stop talking, because it is quiet inside a sod house. That is the part nobody who has not been in one can be made to understand. In a frame house in a Nebraska blow, the whole building talks all night, the siding works, the windows shudder, the stovepipe moans, and you lie there and listen to it, and some part of you never sleeps. In a sod house, you cannot hear the wind at all. You can see the grass laid flat outside the window and hear nothing but the fire. Men would stand in that room and go quiet, and then they would say some version of the same sentence, and she heard it 40 times that winter. My God, it's still in here. Then came the 5th of January, 1885. It began at about 2 in the afternoon with a sky the color of a dirty nickel and a temperature of 31 degrees. Warm enough that half the county was out doing chores in shirt sleeves, and by 4 o'clock the wind had gone round into the northwest, and the temperature had dropped 4 degrees in 2 hours, and the air was full of snow so fine and so fast that a man could not see the ground he was standing on. It blew for 3 days. The section gang, 11 men, were caught out on the grade 1.5 miles east of the ridge with a handcar and no shelter, because the foreman had misread the sky the same as everyone else. They started for town and lost the town almost at once, the way you do. And what saved every one of their lives was that the ridge is 15 feet higher than the flat, and that Huldah Brenner had, on the 2nd of January, for no reason she could ever afterward name, hung a lantern in her north window every night and left it burning. They came in at about 6:30, roped together with a coil of signal wire, following a light they had argued about for 20 minutes. 11 railroad men and 1 woman in a 16 by 32-foot room for 3 days. She fed them out of a cellar hole with 200 pounds of potatoes and a barrel of cornmeal and a smoked ham hung in the north corner, and she boiled snow for water. And they slept on the floor in rows with their coats over them and the door barred with a cull tie, and one of them, an Irishman named Fenner, sang for 4 hours on the second night until the others made him quit. On the second morning the foreman, a hard gray man named Tolliver, who had built railroad in 3 states, stood at the north window scraping frost off the glass with his thumbnail and looking out at a world where you could not see 40 feet. And he said, "Without turning round, ma'am, what's this wall run? Thick. 3 foot at the bottom," she said. 2 foot 2 at the top. Tolliver put his hand flat on it. "I have been 40 years in this country," he said, "and I have wintered in a caboose, and I have wintered in a dugout, and I have wintered in a section house, and I have never been warm." He rapped it twice with his knuckle. "There is 11 men alive in this room, and there is a hotel in that town with 31 rooms in it, and I would not spend a night in it in this weather for wages." The storm cleared on the 8th. 4 people died in that county in those 3 days, 2 men caught between farms, and a woman and her hired girl who went out for coal at a house on the edge of town, 22 yards from the door, and were found on the 9th. It was not a bad death toll for that storm. It was a very bad one for that town. The 11 men walked to Harrow Bend on the morning of the 8th and told the whole of it in both saloons before noon. By the 1st of March, 4 families in that valley had come out to the ridge and asked Huldah Brenner straight out, hat in hand, how a person went about building one. She told them. She told them everything, in detail, for nothing. And when they got confused, she drew it in the dirt with a stick, and when Hollis Pike, who had come out with his hat literally in his hands, and who could not look at her, asked whether she would come and lay out his corners for him, she said yes. And she went, and she charged him nothing, and would not discuss it. 4 sod houses went up in that valley in the spring of 1885. It was not a landslide. It was 4. But it was 4 out of 11 company houses, and the improvement company sold 2 lots between January and June, where it had sold 31 in the same months the year before, and it is worth saying plainly what that was and was not. It was not that a woman had shamed a town, it was that a town had spent a winter. And some of it had spent that winter warm, and some of it had spent that winter cold, and people are not fools about their own skins for very long. Absalom Creed understood exactly what was happening, because it was his business to understand, and he did the thing that men in his position have done since the invention of the corporation. He decided that the answer was a bigger show. The Cosmopolitan Hotel was finished and empty. So, in April of 1885, he went east, and he came back with a scheme, an excursion. A special train of 5 coaches out of Omaha, 180 prospective purchasers, 3 days at Harrow Bend at the company's expense, a brass band, a barbecue, a photographer from Lincoln, and a printed prospectus with a steel engraving of Main Street on the cover. He mortgaged the yard stock to do it personally on his own note, and everyone in that town knew it because his clerk told his wife. The excursion train was scheduled to arrive at Harrow Bend on the morning of Wednesday, the 17th of June, 1885. The photographer from Lincoln came up 10 days early to make his views, and he made 11 of them. Main Street looking north, Main Street looking south, the hotel with the band in front of it, the lumber yard with the stacks squared off, the depot, the school, the church, 3 views of the valley. And on the 11th of June, he walked a mile out of town with his camera on his shoulder and climbed the ridge. Because he was a professional, and because he had noticed that from up there you got the whole town in one frame with the river behind it, and he set his tripod up in Huldah Brenner's dooryard and asked her permission, which nobody had done in 14 months. She gave it. She gave him a cup of coffee, too, and he drank it sitting on her doorstep, looking at the sunflowers she had seeded into her roof the previous 4th of July, which had come up that spring in a solid band 11 feet long across the south slope of it and were 4 feet tall and just starting to head. He made his view of the town. Then he turned the camera around and made one of the house. He did not do it for money, and he never sold it. He did it because he had been photographing frame towns for 9 years, and he had never seen a wall like that, and because a soddy with a row of sunflowers growing out of the roof and a heavy woman in a blue sunbonnet standing in the door with her hand up shading her eyes is, whatever else it is, a photograph. That negative survived. Everything else he exposed in Harrow Bend that week did not, along with the camera, the wagon, the hotel, the bandstand, the prospectus, the stacks, and the town. Tuesday, the 16th of June, 1885, came up hot and dead still, and by 9 in the morning it was 88 degrees, and the air over the flat ground was already shaking. Everybody in that valley who lived through the day remembered the stillness. It was not a calm. A calm has some ease in it. This was the kind of stillness where the cottonwood leaves down along the river, which never in their lives stopped moving, hung straight down, and did not turn over once, and where the meadowlarks that sing on every fence post in Nebraska in June from 4 in the morning until dark quit singing at about 11 o'clock and did not start again. Hulda Brenner was whitewashing. She had the ladder against the south wall and a bucket of lime wash, and she was doing the outside of her house, which she did every June. And she stopped at about 11:30 because the sweat was running into her eyes faster than she could blink it out, and she stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked around at the day. The sky in the west, out past the Lund place, had a look to it she did not have a name for. It was not dark. It was the wrong color. It was a kind of soft yellow-brown low down with a hard white anvil standing over it, so tall it went up out of sight, and the top of that white thing was moving, even though nothing at ground level was moving at all. Ivar Lund rode up the ridge at 20 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. He did not get down off the horse. He said, in a voice she had never heard out of him, "Get everything of yours inside, and shut the door and do not go out." She said, "How bad?" He said, "My grandmother in Norway would say to go to the church. My father would say to go in the cellar. I have seen this sky one time, in Kansas in 1880, and I am not going to tell you what I saw. I am going to go and get the pikes." He was already turning the horse. She said, "Ivar, bring them here." He looked back at her. She said, "Bring anybody. This is the strongest building in this valley, and I have got the only cellar hole on this ridge, and I have got room for 30 people on that floor. Ride into town and tell them." And Ivar Lund, who was a careful man and had never in 4 years said a foolish thing, said, "They will not come." She said, "Tell them anyway." He went. He rode to the Pikeses first and got Nettie Fay and her sister, who was visiting, and put them in the cart and sent them up the ridge road with a boy driving, and then he rode into Harrow Bend at a dead gallop down the middle of Main Street at 10 minutes to 5 in the afternoon and told the town. He got 11 people. 11 out of 140 in the town proper. It is easy, at this distance, to call the other 129 fools. They were not fools. Consider what was actually being said to them. A Norwegian dirt farmer, wringing wet, on a blown horse, rides into a town in the middle of the afternoon and tells everybody to leave their houses and their stores and their stock and walk a mile out of town and uphill, in the heat, to shelter in the dirt house of a fat woman the newspaper had made a joke of on account of the color of the sky. 2 men laughed at him in front of the hardware. Absalom Creed came out of the yard office and stood at the gate with his thumbs in his waistcoat and said, loud enough to be heard across the street, that he had been in this country as long as anybody and there had never been a bad wind at Harrow Bend, and that if a storm came up they had 31 good buildings to be in and the finest hotel in 3 counties. But 11 came. Reverend Stubbs came and brought his wife and the baby, because he had a good ear for the sound of a man who is not exaggerating. Purvis, the depot agent, came after he had wired the dispatcher at Grand Island, and he brought his wife's sister. Kroll the blacksmith closed his shop and came and brought his wife and their 2 boys. Otho Rennick the livery boy came, and on his own hook he unhitched every animal in the livery barn and turned them all loose into the street, which was the single most useful thing any human being did in Harrow Bend that day, because a loose horse can run and a tied one cannot. They came up the ridge road strung out over half a mile in the heat, and Hulda Brenner stood in her dooryard and counted them in, and the last of them got to her door at 25 minutes past 6. By then the sky in the west was green, not a figure of speech. Green, the color of a bottle, and underneath the green a black wall going up out of the horizon with no top to it that anybody could see. And along the bottom of the black there was a ragged pale line like surf, and the whole thing was standing still in the sky and getting bigger, which is what a thing does when it is coming straight at you. The air went cold. That was the part that undid people. It had been 91 degrees at 5 o'clock, and in about 4 minutes it went down into the low 70s, and the wind came around out of the east, out of the wrong quarter, blowing hard back toward the storm, and the dust off the flat ground began to run east along the ground in sheets. Then They heard it. Everyone who has heard it says the same thing, and every one of them is a little embarrassed by how ordinary the words are. They say it sounded like a freight train. It does. It sounds exactly like a freight train that is not going anywhere. A heavy grinding roar with a hollow in the middle of it, and it is the wrongness of hearing that sound come out of the sky and not off the rails that puts the fear into a person. Nettie Fay Pike said, "Oh," and took hold of Huldah's arm. Huldah Brenner stood in her own doorway and looked at it for perhaps 10 seconds. It was a mile and a half off, and it was coming up the valley from the southwest, and it was not the neat white funnel of the picture books. It was a black column, half a mile wide at the bottom, wrapped in rain and dirt, leaning, with the whole of the base of it boiling, and it was throwing things. She could see them going up. Little specks turning over and over, a long way up, going up much slower than seemed right. And it was going to pass south of the ridge, and it was going to go through the middle of the town. She turned around and went inside, and she took charge. And the 11 people in that room afterward all described it in almost the same words, which is, that she did not raise her voice one time. Everybody in. Count. 22, counting the baby. Bar the door with the cull tie and drop the 2 iron dogs in the staples. Shutter both south windows with the oak plank shutters she had made in the winter for the cold, and wedge them. Get everyone against the north wall, on the floor, sitting, not standing, and the 2 corners where the partition ties in. Kroll's boys and the Stubbs baby and the women in the northwest corner where the wall is thickest, the men along the partition. The mattress off the bed frame and the table on its side in front of the door, not because a sod wall would fail, but because the door was the only thing in that building that was not 3 feet thick. The lamp out. Wet sacks over the 2 water buckets. And then she said the only other thing she said before it hit, and she said it to 21 people who were sitting on a clay floor in the dark listening to the sky come apart. And Reverend Stubbs put it in his sermon 2 weeks later, word for word. She said, "This wall is 104 foot of laid sod, and it has got the whole prairie in it. It will not go. Whatever you hear, it will not go. Hold on to whoever is next to you, and do not let go, and do not open that door, not for anything, not for any voice." Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the north wall between Nettie Fay Pike and Mrs. Kroll, and took hold of both of them. It hit the town of Harrow Bend at 11 minutes before 7 in the evening. It took 4 minutes to cross the town. Inside the house on the ridge, a mile north, the first thing was not sound. It was the door. The oak door with 2 iron dogs in the staples and a cull tie barred across it and a table wedged against that jumped in its frame. Twice, hard, like something big had run into it, and then it began to suck outward with a groaning of the strap hinges. And the wet sacks came off the water buckets and went up and stuck flat against the roof. Then the sound arrived, and it was so much larger than any sound any of them had ever been inside of that several of them could not afterward describe it at all. Mrs. Kroll said she heard nothing, that it was a great pressure and not a noise. Purvis said it was 100 wagons going over a plank bridge. The Reverend Stubbs, who was 31 and had never been out of Indiana until he was 28, said it was like standing under a waterfall inside a mill. The house did not move. That is the whole of it, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because for 4 minutes 22 human beings sat on a clay floor in the dark inside 3 feet of prairie sod, while the air outside went past at a speed that was taking 2-story buildings off their foundations a mile away, and the thing they were sitting inside of did not so much as shift a brick. The roof breathed. That was the only structural thing anyone felt. The whole roof lifted, or seemed to, a half-inch or an inch, and the muslin ceiling bellied down and then went up tight against the purlins, twice, like a lung. Dirt came through the muslin in a fine, stubby sift, and got in everybody's hair and eyes and mouth. The stovepipe went out through the gable thimble with a bang, and after that there was a hole in the west gable the size of a stovepipe, and the wind came in through it in a jet you could feel across the room. And Kroll the blacksmith crawled over and put his coat in it and held it there for 4 minutes with both hands. The Stubbs baby slept through the whole of it. Babies do, sometimes. Nobody ever explained it. And then it went off east and the sound went with it, and the pressure came back into people's ears, and it began to rain, and the rain was so heavy and so straight down that when Otho Rennick unbarred the door 20 minutes later, he could not see the bottom of the ridge. They stood in the doorway, all of them, in the rain, and looked south. There was nothing there. Not rubble. That is what everyone says wrong when they tell it. There was no pile. The town of Harrow Bend, 31 frame buildings and a hotel with a cupola and 240 platted lots and a lumber yard with 200 feet of stacked pine along the siding, was simply not there anymore. And in the last of the light through the rain, what they were looking at was a wet gray flat place with a few sticks standing up out of it and the railroad grade running across it. And everything that had been a town was strung out for 4 miles across the prairie to the east. The lumber went the farthest. That was the terrible irony of that evening, and it took the county about a day and a half to work it out. Absalom Creed's yard, 200 feet of squared stacks, 111,000 board feet of Wisconsin pine, went into the air at the very start of it, and it did not come down as a pile in the yard. It came down all across the eastern half of that valley as boards, edge on, driven into the ground and into haystacks and into cattle and through the walls of the 4 buildings on the east edge of town that might otherwise have half survived. Every man who walked that ground afterward said the same thing. The wind killed nobody. The lumber did. They started down off the ridge at about 7:30, all of them, in the rain, with 2 lanterns and a hurricane lamp among them, and Hulda Brenner did not go with them. She stayed for 11 minutes, and what she did in those 11 minutes was the reason a lot of people lived through that night. She sent Otho Rennick, who was 17 and fast, back down to the flat with orders to catch any loose horse he could, saddle nothing, ride bareback, and go east to Ivor Lund's and to the Barclays and to every place still standing and tell them to come with wagons and lanterns and every quilt in the house. She sent Mrs. Stubbs and Mrs. Kroll to stay in the house with the baby and the 2 boys and Nettie Fay's sister, and she told them exactly what to do, which was to build up the fire, put on every pot she had, fill both buckets from the barrel, get every quilt and coat and sheet out of the trunk and off the bed, and tear the muslin ceiling down into strips. Tear the ceiling down. That was the order. 31 yards of clean muslin torn into bandage. Then she took the hurricane lamp and went down the ridge with the rest of them, and she was the slowest one down that slope by a long way. And it did not matter in the least, because for the next 9 hours, the only thing in that valley that moved slowly and did not stop was worth more than anything that ran. She was on that flat from 8 in the evening until 4:30 in the morning. There is no need to describe all of it. It was the worst night that county ever had, and the details of it belong to the people it happened to. 17 people died in Harrow Bend on the 16th of June, 1885. 40-some were hurt, 11 of them badly. The Dr. Ephraim Pyle worked out of the wreck of his own drugstore by lantern light on a door laid across 2 barrels, and he had no supplies at all, because his supplies were in Kansas. What he had was a woman who arrived at about 9 o'clock with 31 yards of muslin torn into strips in a flour sack, and who then sat down beside him on an upturned crate and stayed there. Because that is the thing about a night like that, and everybody who has been in one knows it, the work is not heroic. The work is that somebody has to hold the lamp. Somebody has to hold the lamp steady for 4 hours while the doctor works, and somebody has to hold a man's shoulders down, and somebody has to be big enough and calm enough that when a hurt person takes hold of them, they cannot be pulled over. Hulda Brenner weighed 294 pounds, and she had a grip like a vise from 2,000 sod bricks. And on the night of the 16th of June, she was the most useful human being on that prairie, and there was not one person there who did not understand it at the time. At about 11 o'clock, they found Del Hale. He had not been in town. He had ridden in at 6 to buy a barrel of nails and had started home and had gotten as far as the east edge, and they found him 140 yards out in the grass, alive, with a broken leg and a broken collarbone and a piece of Absalom Creed's lumber through the meat of his thigh, and it took 4 men to get him onto a door and carry him in. He was conscious. He looked up at the woman holding the lantern over him and said, through his teeth, "Well, that is a hell of a thing." "Yes, it is," she said. He said, "Ma'am, is your house standing?" She said, "It is." Del Hale shut his eyes and said, "All right." And then he said, "Take me up there." And they did, and he was in her bed for 9 weeks. At about 2 in the morning they found Absalom Creed. He was sitting on the concrete counterweight of his own hay scale, which was the only thing left in his lumber yard, in the rain, in his shirt sleeves, with his hands hanging between his knees, and he had been sitting there for some hours. He was not hurt. Not one splinter had touched him. He had ridden it out in the cellar under the yard office with his wife, and the office had gone off over their heads, and they had both come up without a scratch. His stock was gone. His hotel was gone. His town was gone. His personal note for the excursion, $4,200, was in a safe somewhere out on the prairie, but the man who held it was in Omaha and was not going to be blown away. Hulda Brenner came up the yard with a lantern at 2 in the morning looking for people who could not walk, and she found him sitting there, and they looked at each other for the first time since he had crossed the street to avoid her. Nobody has ever known exactly what was said. There were 2 men within earshot, and they gave 2 different accounts, and neither one of them was steady on his feet at the time. What is agreed is that she stood there about half a minute, and that what she said to him was short, and that Absalom Creed got up off that counterweight and followed her, and that he worked at the doctor's door and barrels table until daylight, holding lanterns and fetching water, in his shirt sleeves, in the rain, alongside the woman his newspaper had called the proprietress of the Mud Cathedral. One of the 2 men said she told him, "There is work, come and do it." The other said she told him, "Mr. Creed, get up. You are not the story tonight." Either way, he got up. For 19 days after the 16th of June, the town of Harrow Bend, Nebraska, consisted of one room 16 feet by 32 on a ridge a mile north of where the town had been. There were never fewer than 30 people on that ridge in the daylight, and never fewer than 18 sleeping there at night. They slept on the clay floor in rows, and in the lean-to Ivor Lund and Kroll threw up against the south wall out of salvaged boards on the 2nd day, and in 3 tents that came up from Grand Island on the relief train on the 19th. And Del Hale had the bed because he could not be moved, and because nobody argued about it. The relief came the way it always did in that country, which is to say fast, and from strangers. The dispatcher at Grand Island had Purvis's wire sent at 7 minutes past 5, and when Harrow Bend did not answer at 8, he sent a train up as far as the washed-out grade, and men walked in the last 3 miles with lanterns before midnight. By the 21st, there was a relief committee, a subscription list, and 4 doctors. Custer County sent 11 wagons. A church in Omaha sent $600 and 41 quilts. That is not the part of the story anybody needs telling. It is how those places always behaved, and it is to their credit, and it was not remarkable to them. What was remarkable, and what got into the papers as far as Chicago, was the house. The Omaha Bee ran it on the 22nd under the heading A House of Earth, and the Lincoln paper ran a longer piece, and both of them ran the photographer's view, the one he had made on the 11th of June and had sent to his own home address before the excursion because he was careful with his negatives. Sunflowers on the roof, 4 feet high in a band along the south slope. A woman in a blue sunbonnet in the doorway with her hand up, shading her eyes. And behind her, in the middle distance, small and white and perfectly sharp, the town of Harrow Bend. They printed that photograph beside a view made on the 18th from the same tripod holes, and the second one is one of the strangest pictures of the American West, because it is the identical composition, the identical house, the identical sunflowers, and where the town is, there is nothing at all. The Harrow Bend Clarion came out again on the 11th of July, printed in Grand Island because the press was under 4 feet of dirt. And Wilbur Sneed, who had written the Mud Cathedral item 15 months before, and who had lost his shed, his press, his stock, and 2 fingers, set the following on the front page in the middle of a column of names to Miss Huldah Brenner of Section 18. This paper printed a jest at her expense in April of 1884 and named her house the Mud Cathedral. 22 persons came out of that house alive on the night of the 16th of June, and this office is informed that they included the editor's own sister and her child. The name stands. The jest is withdrawn. She never mentioned it to him, not once, in the 29 years they lived in the same town afterward. He mentioned it to her twice. The rebuilding began on the 6th of July, and the argument about how to build was over in about 4 days, and it was not won by any speech. It was won because the sod was free, and the railroad was hauling relief and would not haul commercial lumber up a washed grade for 11 days, and because 41 families had spent 19 days sleeping inside 3 feet of prairie sod in the hottest fortnight of the year, and had noticed that it was 68 degrees in there at 2 in the afternoon. They called it the Sod Bee, and it ran from the 6th of July to the 29th of August, and it was the largest cooperative building effort in the history of that county. 19 sod houses, 1 sod store, 1 sod church with a 14-foot ceiling, and a sod schoolhouse 24 by 40 with a shingle roof, all of it laid up in 8 weeks by people, most of whom had never laid a brick in their lives. Huldah Brenner laid out every one of them. She could not build 19 houses. What she could do, and what she did for 55 days, was walk from site to site with her father's level and her folding rule and her chalk line, and set the corners and check the batter and teach. She taught it in the same 11 sentences every time, and they were still saying them in that county in 1920. Get on high ground and dig a ditch round it. Old short grass from a ridge, never slough grass. Cut 4 inches deep, not 5, 2 days after a rain. Chop them 30 inches and chop them in 1 stroke. Grass side down, always, and the wall will grow together. Break every joint. Never let a joint stand over a joint. Every 3rd course crosswise or you have got 2 thin walls and not 1 thick one. Lean the face in 1.5 inches to the foot. Willow poles in the 4th course and the 8th. Bring your eaves out 18 inches and your wall will never wash. They called that last set of rules the Brenner Bond for about 40 years, and there are men alive whose grandfathers taught it to them as a thing everybody knew, without any idea where it came from. Absalom Creed left Harrow Bend on the 14th of August, 1885. He was ruined, personally and completely. The improvement company's eastern shareholders liquidated in September and got about 11 cents. His note for the excursion was called, and he paid what he could and was sued for the rest. He and his wife went to Kansas City, and he took a position as a bookkeeper in a wholesale grocery, and he held it for 19 years and died in 1904. Before he went, he came up the ridge, on foot, on a Thursday morning, in a coat gone shiny at the elbows, and he stood in her dooryard and would not come inside. He said, "I have got no apology that is worth the breath. I would only be asking you to make me comfortable, and I have decided not to do that." She said, "All right." He said, "I want to ask you something instead, and it is for me and not for you, so you may refuse it. When you told me in my office that a wall is a bet a man makes with the weather, did you know? Standing there in April of last year with $40. Did you know this was coming?" And Huldah Brenner said, "Mr. Creed, nobody knows what is coming. That is the entire reason to build thick." He stood there a moment. Then he said, "That is worse, somehow." And he put his hat on and walked back down the Ridge Road, and she never saw him again, though she got a letter from him in 1891 asking, of all things, for the specifications of the roof on behalf of a man in Kansas, and she wrote him 4 pages back and did not charge him for it. Del Hale got out of that bed on the 22nd of August with a leg an inch and a half shorter than the other one and a limp he kept for the rest of his life. On the last morning, sitting on the edge of the bed with his crutch across his knees while she made him take his coffee sitting down, he took a thing out of his shirt pocket and put it on the table. It was a watch, open face, worn silver, with a bent bow. He said that was Orrin's. It was in his pocket when the mule got him, and it was in my pocket the night of the 16th, and a board went through my leg 9 inches from it and never touched it. He looked at the wall. I have carried it 14 months, and I have known the whole 14 months who it belonged to. She said, it belongs to his brother. He said, no, ma'am. He got up on the crutch, which took him a while, and he was not a graceful man about it. He wrote you 4 letters, and he got kicked before he could write the 5th, and I read the 5th one in that tin box the day after we buried him. I went out there, and I read it before you ever got off that train. He stopped there in the doorway with his back to her. It says, do not let my brother, and it stops, and I know how it ends. It ends, do not let my brother have this place, because he will drink it. And he was right, and I have got it, and I am drinking it, and I am going to stop. He put the watch down on the table and went out. He did stop, as it happened. Not all at once, and not without going back on it twice. But by 1888 he was farming that quarter well enough that Ivar Lund would lend him a team, which in that valley was a formal certificate of character, and he proved up on it in 1889, and he stood witness for her on her own final proof 3 months later. Ivar Lund asked her to marry him on the 11th of October, 1885, standing in her dooryard with his hat in both hands, and he made a mess of it. He had a speech. He had been building it since about the previous November, and he had it in Norwegian and had translated it into English, and about 9 words into it he ran off the rails entirely and stopped and stood there. And then he said the thing he had not meant to say, which was, I do not want a housekeeper. I have kept my own house 4 years, and I keep it well. I want the person who put the willow in the 4th course. And Hulda Brenner, who was 29 years old and had been laughed at on a railway platform in that county 18 months before by 40 people, put her hands over her face and cried for the first time since the day she read the unfinished letter in the burned dugout, and then wiped her face with her apron and said yes. And then, because she was who she was, said, and we will live in my house, because it is the better house, and you know it is. He said, yes, I know it is. I have known it since the 2nd day. They were married in the sod church on the 8th of November, 1885, by the Reverend Aquila Stubbs, and the church was so full that men stood outside the door in the cold with their hats off, and Nettie Fay Pike, who was expecting again and would that time carry it, stood up with her. She did not take his name on the land. That was Barnabas Quint's doing, in a letter, and it was shrewd. She was 2 years into a 5-year residence, and a change of name in the middle of a homestead entry could raise a question. And Quint wrote her 3 pages about how to avoid the question altogether, and she followed it to the letter. The final certificate on the northwest quarter of Section 18 was issued on the 14th of September, 1889, to Hulda Brenner, single woman at the time of entry, and the patent came out of Washington the next spring with a facsimile signature of Benjamin Harrison on it, and she framed it and hung it on the whitewashed wall over the brass-bound trunk, and it hung there for 41 years. Arrow Bend was rebuilt, but not where it had been. The railroad, working from its own arithmetic, decided that the grade could be improved by a mile, and moved the depot north and east that autumn, and the new town went up around the new depot, and it went up mostly in sod for its first 3 years and then in brick, because a brick yard was opened in 1888 on the clay of a certain ridge by a woman who had grown up in one and who had been telling anybody who would listen since April of 1884 that there was clay under that gumbo worth more than any corn crop that would ever be taken off it. She ran that yard for 22 years. It employed as many as 19 men. The courthouse annex in that county is faced with her brick, and so is the school. And so are 11 of the storefronts on the main street of the town that stands there now, and there is nothing whatever on any of them that says so. They had 2 children, which surprised the doctor and did not surprise her, a daughter in 1887 and a son in 1891. The daughter became a school teacher and then a county superintendent of schools. The son took over the brickyard and lost it in 1930 and got it back in 1936. Ivar Lund died in 1922. Hulda outlived him by 11 years and died in her own bed in the northwest corner of that room in March of 1933 at 77 years of age, having never once in her life weighed less than 260 pounds, and having built with her own hands the only building within 9 miles of Harrow Bend, Nebraska, that stood up on the 16th of June, 1885. The house outlasted her. The sod walls stood, whitewashed, lived in, roofed and re-roofed until 1951, when the grandson put a frame addition on the south side and the county assessor came out and wrote in his book, "Main structure sod, condition sound," and then wrote underneath it, in the same hand, 67 years. They took it down in 1968 to widen a road. It took a bulldozer most of a day. The operator, who was 24 and had knocked down a great many buildings, said afterward that he had never hit anything like it in his life and that the north wall did not break. It moved, in one piece, about 4 feet, and sat there. There is a marker on that ridge now, put up by the County Historical Society in 1982, and it has the photograph on it, the one from the 11th of June, sunflowers and all. And there is one more thing, and it is the thing worth carrying away. In the 92-page county history published in 1931, there is a chapter on the cyclone, and it lists the 17 dead and the 41 injured and the losses in dollars, and at the end of it there is one sentence about the house on the ridge that has been quoted in that county ever since, and nobody knows which of the old women on the committee wrote it. It says, "They laughed at her on the platform because she was heavy, and 2 years later the only thing in this valley heavy enough to stay was hers."